Thanks once again for tuning in to the Explaining History podcast. And today I want to talk about the early anti-Soviet operations of the CIA after the Second World War. We'll be looking a little bit at Tim Weiner's excellent book, Legacy of Ashes, and a few of the primary sources to go with it. The point that Tim Weiner makes in the book, which I think is obviously it's an obvious one, but it's an interesting one nonetheless, was that during the Second World War, the USA found common cause not just with the Soviet Union but with other communist insurgency groups across Europe, and who would later form the new communist governments. They found common cause with them against fascism, and later, after the Second World War, found common cause with fascists against the Soviet Union. And the way in which that happened was through the embryonic CIA. Now, if you remember a previous podcast I did on this subject about Harry Truman and the founding of the CIA was not initially intended to be anything more than an information service for the president, essentially one page of A4 on both sides with the information, the top half dozen things that the president needed to know about that day. President Truman, was not particularly well versed on international affairs, and found the new world in which he came to office in 1945 quite a challenging one, and needed a way of keeping himself informed. By the late 1940s, various figures within the new intelligence community of America were envisaging something a lot more ambitious, and envisaging an organisation that had the possibility to fight a guerrilla war against communism around the world. And there were within the new CIA figures such as Bill Donovan from the OSS and Frank Wisner, who we're going to talk about extensively in a moment. These people were passionate anti-communists and anti-communist idealists, really, who saw America's role now in the post-war world as one of being directly combative towards communism, and that there was now a crusade against communism to be fought. And this isn't quite how Truman saw things. Frank Wisner is one of the most important OSS agents in Europe. He had formed friendships with King Michael of Romania and had been posted to Turkey during the war, where there had been talk of attempting to bring the Turks into the war against Germany. He was one of the first agents in Europe to, even from as early as 1944, to report back that the communists were going to attempt a takeover of Eastern Europe. He was quite disappointed with the response he got, firstly from Roosevelt and then from Truman. Truman becomes a convert really slightly later on to the anti-communist cause, recognising that the authority of the United States was being directly challenged from late 1945 onwards, but certainly doing something about the attempted takeover of the Eastern Europe and the development of satellite states there. Perhaps it would have been beyond America's means anyway. Wisner was part of an informal set called the Georgetown Club, a grouping of OSS agents, diplomats, journalists, and public intellectuals. These were people who had met on an informal basis before the war in Washington, and they had it featured some quite influential figures who would later include people such as Alan Dulles, James Angleton, later director of the CIA, Averell Harriman, and other significant luminaries such as Dean Acheson and George Kennan. The Georgetown set, or the Georgetown Club, were men who shared broadly socially liberal views on domestic matters within the USA. They tended to rather cringe at the Jim Crow laws in the South and believe in a more pluralistic and liberal society. They were Democrats by instinct at home, but anti-communist hawks overseas, and they were, between the kind of the right end of the Democrats and the left end of the Republicans. Sally Reston, one of the wives of one of the members of the club, said, "We were liberal anti-communist intellectuals, precisely the class and breed that Joe McCarthy hated and whose careers he wanted to ruin. It was the same old battle, the Republican right versus the Democrat left." Frank Wisner and George Kennan, between them, created the Office of Special Projects in 1948. Bear in mind, the OSS had been closed down, in large part at the demand of J. Edgar Hoover, who saw it as a rival to the FBI and convinced Truman that it could form some kind of domestic Gestapo in the USA. It's ironic, really, that Hoover made that accusation, because if there had ever been a politicised police force in the USA that had waged war on political dissidents, he ran it. The FBI certainly at times has fitted that bill. The Office of Special Projects was later in 1948 renamed the Office of Policy Coordination, and then that was merged into the CIA. The CIA is able to incorporate these different aspects of espionage work, and the OPC becomes the paramilitary wing of the CIA. In the early years of the OPC and the CIA in general, you see an immense capacity for imaginative but kind of magical thinking as well. Initiatives and plans that aren't really based in any sound coherent logic, but they seem ideologically sound, and they are a kind of an attempt to try to do something. Often during periods in the Second World War, and this was particularly kind of British trait, but the Americans indulge in it as well. Often there was, amongst Allied forces, particularly before 1943, amongst some of the Special Forces branches particularly, there was a culture of, if in doubt, try to do something, try to take the fight to the enemy somehow. It might just work. The problem with the initiatives that were being raised was that men who were recruited by the OPC, by Frank Wisner, large numbers of them were sent to their deaths. The recruiting ground for newfound anti-communists was the American sector of occupied Germany, which was filled and was filling with displaced peoples and refugees, many of whom were fleeing communism. It was hoped that among the anti-communist exiles, Germans, Poles, Baltic states, Hungarians, Romanians, and the various diaspora of Eastern Europe would be the core of some new force to fight back against communism. A reserve for a possible war emergency, as Wisner put it. The problem was that the exiles, the men and women, were split culturally, nationally, linguistically, and politically between monarchists, republicans, nationalists, fascists, social democrats, and others, and getting a disparate group of people angry and resentful and bitter against communism to work together was very difficult, and to form it into some kind of cohesive unit was nigh on impossible. Wisner wanted to equip them with guns and as much money as they needed to finance themselves, He wanted to train them in espionage and really have them return to their home countries to be an army in waiting, or a guerrilla force in waiting. Now, this is all fanciful stuff and largely naive as to the facts of Soviet occupation. You only need to have a look at places such as Ukraine and how Ukraine was pacified at the end of the Second World War, and how guerrilla fighters against the Soviets were violently crushed, or the Baltic states, to see that there was going to be virtually no chance that the Soviets would tolerate or brook any kind of fifth columnist force on their territory. Which is why I made the point earlier on about there being this degree of magical thinking in early CIA operations. The chiefs of the CIA were very reluctant to allow Weissner or any of the other OPC men to go ahead with this scheme. He faced a huge difficulty, huge obstacle in 1949, which was really the fact that the agency had no legal authority to carry out these kinds of covert actions against any country. Once a war is being declared, there is a kind of a legal certainty that all branches of the armed services can go ahead and do whatever the president orders them, or to act in the field as they see operationally fit, within obviously certain parameters. But during peacetime, peace in inverted commas obviously, but during the Cold War, where war had not been declared against, say, Czechoslovakia or Hungary, or let alone the Soviet Union, the legal remit of secret agents to do intelligence gathering is tightly monitored, but the legal remit of proxies of the United States to wage some kind of armed insurrection against what ultimately has become a sovereign state, somewhere such as, say, East Germany, is incredibly dubious, incredibly legally questionable. The CIA had no charter from Congress and no funds that were legally authorised for any of these early kind of what you would call black operations. And so the CIA was acting illegally beyond the bounds of United States law. And to place this in context, America, in the run-up to the Second World War, had, in the guise of the Neutrality Acts, had stringent controls on what it is private American citizens could do and couldn't do, the business deals they could and couldn't make that might potentially drag the entire country into global conflict. The CIA's first director, Roscoe Hillenkoetter, paid a visit in February 1949 to Carl Vinson, who was a Democrat on the chair of the House Armed Services Committee. Hillenkoetter basically said to Vinson that Congress would have to pass formal legislation that gave the CIA the budget that it wanted, and it needed to do it as soon as possible. The agency was running all sorts of operations without legal funding, and it needed to have the retrospective legal cover that could be only granted by Congress. The problem was, of course, that the CIA was unwilling to explain to Congress what it needed money for. Vinson said, "We will just have to tell the House. They will have to accept our judgment, and we cannot answer a great many questions that might be asked." In part, the reason for this was the extremely controversial nature of the missions that were being run and were being devised by Frank Reisner. In May 1949, the CIA Act was passed, and this gave the CIA enormous powers which were only prohibited from being used within the United States itself, so that the prediction or the fear that was put forth by J. Edgar Hoover, that there might be an American Gestapo emerge, was not possible. But how the CIA was allowed to act overseas was an entirely different matter. For this, there was basically no oversight. The Armed Services Subcommittee of Congress would approve an annual budget. The budget itself would be secret for the CIA each year. One of the CIA's many powers was to have a wish list of 100 overseas nationals who could come to be resettled in the USA every single year and effectively be given permanent residence without regard to their inadmissibility under the immigration or any other laws, meaning that the normally strict policies on political and ideological extremists being sifted out from entering the United States. You can still, on a flight to America, fill in a green card with all these sorts of curious questions about if you've ever been in a member of the SS or anything like that. These didn't apply to the chosen few that were introduced into America by the CIA. As I said at the start of the podcast, the CIA's policy of the enemy of one's enemy is one's friend meant that the CIA would now start to find common cause with nationalist extremists, fascists, and those who up until recently the United States would have considered enemies. On the day that the CIA Act was signed into law, a Ukrainian nationalist extremist, Mykola Lebed, who was quoted as rendering valuable assistance to the agency in Europe, was smuggled into America. Lebed, for example, had assassinated the Polish Interior Minister in 1936 and escaped when Germany attacked Poland 3 years later. He was an ally of the Nazis, as many Ukrainians turned out to be, and he was an SS volunteer for the Nazis. He formed in 2 battalions of troops that fought in the Carpathian Mountains for the Germans against the Red Army, and at the end of the war he fought a long guerrilla war in the Ukraine against the Soviets. This war went on until about 1948 and was obviously eventually crushed by the Soviet Union. Ukrainian partisans managed to take time out also to fight the Poles over a territory between Ukraine and Poland as well. And obviously the profound hatred of the Red Army went way back to not just Stalin's famine, but the famines brought about by war communism and the various horrors perpetrated on Ukraine during the Civil War and Stalinist period. Lebed found his way to Munich, where he set himself up as an unofficial foreign minister for Ukraine, which really meant that he was a recruiter of partisans and a contact with the CIA. In the Ukraine, there were still large numbers of partisans who could be mobilized at Lebed's order, and when money changed hands, when the CIA paid him, he ensured that this happened. Even though the US Justice Department declared that Lebed was a war criminal who had participated in the Holocaust, who had murdered Jews, Poles and Ukrainians, and there were attempts to deport him when he wound up on American soil. And these were sabotaged by Alan Dulles, later head of the CIA, who said that he was of inestimable value to the agency, and he was in charge of operations of the first importance. The CIA has few methods of collecting intelligence on the Soviet Union and felt compelled to exploit every opportunity, however slim the possibility of success or unsavoury the agent. This is an extract from the secret CIA history of what is dubbed as the Ukrainian operation. Emigre groups, even those with dubious pasts, were often the only alternative to doing nothing. Sometimes the brutal war record of many emigre groups became blurred as they became more critical to the CIA. So the problem here was that ultimately there was, in this period of stalemate in the Cold War, very little that could be done. the effects of the efforts of Lebed and his partisans in the Ukraine were pretty minimal. There was it has virtually no effect on the Soviet Union. The intelligence that they pass on is of a very low grade. And yet there were figures within the CIA, like Weissner, who believed that doing anything was better than doing nothing. One of the problems here is that men like Weissner were committed to covert action. They believed in it. It was an article of faith for them, much as the Special Operations Executive in Great Britain during the Second World War saw it as vital wartime activities, where much of what the SOE did was counterproductive. It sacrificed large numbers of lives, and it brought back a relatively low grade of operational success or useful intelligence. Not to say that the SOE didn't have some successes, they certainly did. The thinking problem that fuels a lot of this, I think, is the idea that after a series of high-profile failures, that one needs to simply keep going until one reaches successes, that one must absorb losses, particularly of lives, and absorb mission failures, and up until a point where finally a success manages to justify all the sacrifices. This is ripe territory for exploitation. There were a number of former intelligence men, former German Abwehrmen, particularly General Reinhard Gehlen of the Abwehr, who approached the CIA, said essentially, I have networks of German-speaking men behind enemy lines. It's our tradition, it is our duty to fight for Western civilization, and we're ready to join with you. And what Gehlen did was to speak to the hopes of the CIA in Munich and in Frankfurt, and in Berlin. There was pretty much every kind of emigre community that you can imagine, and the CIA, with fairly green agents turning up with an almost unlimited budget, was music to the ears of men who had lost everything and who wished to regain some kind of status, have a flow of income, and to get back to the enjoyable fun that they had engaged in previously of intelligence work. And they saw the Americans as a vehicle to do that. They saw them as naive with open wallets. Their counterparts who had wound up on the other side of the Iron Curtain had very quickly realised that the Soviet system was where their futures lay, whether they liked it or not, and it was best to very quickly cooperate with that. The Stasi was quickly assembled in the post-war years from the remnants of various German Gestapo units. And the idea that covert operations behind enemy lines were possible and were likely to work out wasn't quite an easy sell to American agents who were in Munich and Frankfurt and other parts of the American area of occupation for the first time. CIA agents in the field, because there was no direct oversight from Congress, no presidential oversight, and often because the CIA seemed to operate in an air of informality and chaos, got to devise their own policies and procedures. For example, one agent in Munich, as a young man, Steve Tanner, one of the first 200 CIA agents to graduate, said that in order to receive CIA support, the emigres had to be founded on native soil, so they had to have originally founded a paramilitary or partisan unit in Ukraine or behind the Iron Curtain somewhere. They couldn't have been emigres who simply turned up in American-occupied Germany and announced themselves as freedom fighters. And it was exactly these kinds of characters that the CIA sent to their deaths in large numbers parachuting them in various ill-conceived operations behind enemy lines, where they were quickly captured and executed. And if you read Philip Knightley's biography of Kim Philby, the British-Soviet double agent, it becomes quickly clear that he was responsible for blowing an awful lot of these men's covers. Though he said in an interview with Knightley in Moscow, these were not nice men. These were not noble guys. These were violent, savage killers who had been parachuted into the Soviet Union to do extremely brutal things, which may well be the case. Anyway, I'm going to finish that there. I'm going to continue with this theme in the next few weeks or so, because it is great to delve into intelligence history. Thanks everybody for recent support in a number of little initiatives I've been doing. I have some great feedback recently, some really interesting conversations that are going to come into light on the economic history, which we'll be pursuing soon. And if you can give us a thumbs up on the iTunes page, that would be great. Or even if you check out our Patreon page, any contribution will be gratefully received. Thanks, all the best, bye-bye.